Welcome everyone to January 20th book club container hosted by me, Intrepid Bodies, but also held up by the weavers and the walkers of this way. Um, yeah, today's focus is going to be, and discussion is going to be focused around chapter 18 in Hazrat Inayat Khan's Mysticism of Sound and Music. Base Monster Tiff so graciously read the chapter for us in advance because I wasn't able to make it to today's read aloud or this week's read aloud because I was moving. So, yes, this is the first book club container that I'll be hosting from my new space, which I'm really grateful for. Um, and just in general, I'm excited to discuss this container or discuss this chapter because um, it's on the voice. And some of y'all may know, and if you don't know, you finna know that part of my offerings is, and like my spiritual practice is singing, toning, chanting, singing light language. And I do that all through virtue of my voice. So, yeah, this chapter was pretty profound for me. There were a couple of different frameworks that Hazrat Inayat Khan presented that I really like jived with. So, yeah, I just want to open up the container and welcome you all to discuss anything that may have stood out. Though now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, wait, I wanted to open this container with some chanting. And so I'm feeling into how aligned it would be to record that, but we're already recording. So I'm like, am I going to chant right now? And I think I will. I think I will. And yeah, and then after that, we can jump right into discussing. So thanks for your patience, y'all. And I'll say that I only allow what is for the most cosmic timeline for each person in this container, for myself, and for anyone who listens to this after the fact. Yeah, and thank you. Serem sana, serem sana, sikarash nastoro faratia, kashara. Yavataram no karasiyat no kerenishtu paraya kariyatan emana shukranasam shukranasam koreya nakrasu shikrahat kraniat mastash asyata asyata kuranate saratane yashu sokrono hasyatana tandeyatana korono mentiyat neshem tu hadiyata hadiyata korane korane البحر Elo baho Karanastia para Shkandise Karanat Nishayata Kerematu Mahadu. Thank you all for receiving. Ashe. Nobu said he was toning as well. Thank you for that. Curious how the container feels to y'all now. It definitely feels more spacious to me. Y'all see that? Mm, the fire dances. Just put a moon emoji, a crescent moon emoji in the chat, which feels really aligned to the lineage that I feel I was channeling. Mhm. Nobu says moo. Moo in the chat. Yes. Gang gang. That to me, just for those who are listening asynchronously, ooh, it's 11:11 here. That to me signifies or relates to or brings up my relationship to the lineages related to Mu and Lumeria, ancient and early Lumeria. So thank you for bringing that into this container. The fire dances says that crescent came in heavy. Ashe. It's so weird because I'm like, I feel like lunar lore has been making it to me, like lore that um kind of elucidates or makes clearer for me my relationship to the moon has been coming up. The radio channel in the room is also signified by the different phases of the moon. So each time the phase of the moon changes, the label that we use to signify the radio channel in the Broom Discord server also changes to match um, where the moon is in the sky for most people. So, yes, some really cool lunar lore coming in. I'm just going to kind of hold that in the container as we discuss chapter 18. And I want to welcome you all to either write in the chat or unmute if you feel it's aligned or you can. Um, and I would just love to hear from y'all, like what parts or ideas stood out to you as you were reading or listening to chapter 18, or any reflections you might have about your own relationship to your voice or other voices have after having read this chapter on the voice and the instrumentation of the voice. Yes, I wonder if someone can share the link to the text with the fire dances because I know we have a thread in the broom where you can access the text. That way you can follow along with us. Ashe, thank you, Nobu. I guess I'll start and kick us off. The first thing I wanted to kind of talk about and hone in on is some principles that came up early in the chapter. What Hazrat Inayat Khan calls the three principal kinds of voices, known as the Jalal voice, the Jamal voice, and the Kamal voice. And he writes that the Jalal voice, J, oh my God, J-E-L-A-L voice indicates power. The Jamal voice, Jemal, indicates beauty. And the Kamal voice, Kemal, voice indicates wisdom. So I kind of want to anchor in that part of the text first. And yeah, I guess I'll share for me what came up. Well, a lot of stuff came up first of all listening to this part, but I think the main takeaway from this part of the text has to do with for me the different types of vibrational or like energetic um shapes and textures that a voice can take, whether it's a reading voice, whether it's a speaking voice, whether it's a singing voice. I feel like these principles helped anchor me into understanding the way that cadence in voice can translate into different types of affects for the listener. And so I'm not sure if the framework that Hazrat Inayat Khan gives is like the most contextually up to date, but I also feel like it's a framework that kind of where I can like build out my own framework when I'm thinking about voice. Um, I also had like a little bit of formal, like a very small amount of formal vocal training growing up. Um, and then shortly decided to like play sports, I think. I don't know. I forgot what my decision making process was, but I also feel like this framework shows up even for me when I'm singing or chanting similar to the way that I did when I started this container. Or like for me, sometimes there's a cadence that my voice will take when it's trying to or attempting to capture um, something that is what like he calls like a voice of a power, like indicating power. It also sometimes directly relates to where the sound comes from in my body. So like when I'm trying to exude power, usually that comes from my solar plexus, usually. Then when I'm singing and I'm trying to create affect that represents beauty, my cadence changes. And I'll say that for me personally, where my voice comes from or where the sound exudes from in my body would be like my throat chakra when I'm describing or creating an affect or an atmosphere of beauty. And then when he says when he what he refers to as the voice indicating wisdom, is also a different cadence for me. So all of those things check out for me personally, and I just kind of want to hold space to know how that framework aligns for you all, if it aligns at all, and if not, what framework works for you when you're understanding the effect of voice or sound either as a person singing or the person receiving. I'm gonna hold space and take a sip of my coffee.
I'll say like what you were saying about the throat chakra and beauty definitely aligns for me. And also, yeah, what you said about power and the solar plexus for sure. Um, I guess like the way it kind of aligns for me most, and yeah, I guess, yeah, like I'd say growing up, I felt like I had to exert my truth fairly often. Um, in the sense that like, I think like it's probably for most people, it's more or less habitual um, to speak about things in a way which does not qualify one's own perspective, right? So, um, like when people state things as fact versus like a matter of opinion, I would
Mhm,
say that it's usually okay if what you're stating doesn't conflict with anybody else's perspective, or if what you're talking about doesn't necessarily like encroach upon their perspective, right?
mm,
But I feel like if both of those things are true, then it tends to like kind of project things onto people's solar plexuses. And
mhm,
so like, to make it a bit more concrete, I'll say like growing up, I felt like, like parental figures or authority figures were like constantly trying to tell me what I had said or what I was saying or what I had done. And I would feel this like pretty strongly around my solar plexus. I'll
Mm,
say from an early age, I learned to project, not necessarily like with sound, but like energetically from my solar plexus. And then later on, when I was slightly more adept with words, I would project with sound and what I would call ether from the solar
mm,
plexus in order to, yeah, like basically like burn off whatever they were trying to project onto me.
gosh.
Um, so like that definitely aligns, and like, you know, I didn't even realize I was doing it. I feel like it was something I was doing unconsciously for a while, which made it possible for me to move in those kinds of spaces.
Mm,
Um, and then like when I started to become more like spiritually refined, which I think like connects with something else that Hazrat Inayat Khan was saying, or yeah, um, then I started to realize that there was like a lot of power coming from like that part of my body when I felt like I was under attack in some way.
mm,
Um, and then the other thing I'll say is just like I know that my throat chakra is still opening because I feel like there's tension around it all the time. Like pretty much
mm,
whenever I meditate, I feel like there are openings and like I can feel fascia unsticking around my throat.
mm,
And I also know that like, like I feel like it's pretty rare, I want to say, that like my voice is recognized for beauty. And I think that like that kind of aligns with what you're saying
mm.
about, yeah, like the correlations between those different voices and your own subtle anatomy. Um, so yeah, hopefully that reflection makes sense for you because I know I was talking for a while.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I also feel like there's something auspicious about this container with regard to the opening of my throat chakra. And I'm about to make a Tobacco Maria offering, which feels
Hey.
very related to. So I'm really grateful for this container. And I'd also love to hold space for other people to chime in. So I'm going to mute.
Wow. Thanks for that, Nova. I'm gonna hold some space, too, because I also feel like people can relate to what you said pretty easily. Lexi in the chat said, "Thank you for sharing." I guess I'll also say too, the throat chakra for me is very, very, very interesting as far as subtle anatomy goes. Um, and I won't get into the subtle anatomy of the throat chakra because I feel like we're gonna get there at some point in this container. Um, and I also feel so much of what you said around the sense perception, the felt sense of what it feels like when other people are projecting onto your what you use your power for, or like the intention of your power is kind of like how I understood it. And please correct me if I'm off on that. Is also something that I can relate to. I remember growing up and like this is so weird, but at a very young age experiencing heartburn that was like gut oriented heartburn. I also can remember other instances growing up as a young adult, especially having to get medical treatment for the way that like my solar plexus and the organs connected to the solar plexus would just simply the way that I understand it now, especially with hindsight, is like literally just the felt sense of other perceptions in an area that is I would even go so far as to say is like designed to be the storehouse for one's own perspective, and the work that they're doing to cultivate that perspective really used to take me out growing up. And I think I can relate to that too, in the sense that it had a lot to do with the expectations of my parental figures, other authority figures, other older people who just maybe even were like larger than me. So I just assumed that they were more powerful in the like material sense. Um, and yeah, I feel like that's just so real for a lot of people. So I'm really glad that that's being brought into this container.
I guess like something that was coming through for me just then was, I mean, y'all know because y'all are in Discord right now, but also you're in the conversation I was having earlier about somebody who I'll say, had read a book about shamanism and then was interpreting it in a certain way and speaking from authority, which I think was garnered from, taking, pictures of the book, um, about their interpretation as if it came from the authority of the person who was writing about shamanism. And
Mhm.
something that was coming through for me is something that feels like it's being offered in this container is like how to speak from authority without using words which are authoritative. I think that
Ooh.
relates directly to what you're saying about power. And also, I'd say, like, you know, what the brother XL was saying about feeling a little bit nervous about speaking.
Absolutely. Dang, I'm so glad that you brought up that example because I was like, I wanted to actually, in response to that example earlier in the room, I wanted to say that, but I couldn't find the words to speak to something that I've been thinking about often, which is like absolute power and authority, and like the idea that absolute power and authority corrupts power. And so it's interesting because I feel like oftentimes the things that I'm guided to do in preparation for containers has to relate to a posture of power and a sense of groundedness that relates to like me being in touch with my own experiences, but also like, and y'all know that this is par for the course in this book club, that I'm very careful about words and phrases that unintentionally leak or unintentionally leech power away from other people. Um, and I mean, y'all know I've like spent a lot of time in English literature courses as a non-native English speaker, trying to like muster my way into a place of, I won't even say confidence with the English language, but like a relationship with the English language where I am working on cultivating my ability to broadcast my experiences through a lens of truth that doesn't rely on siphoning other people's power into my own field for that truth to be salient or to be considered true. And so it makes a lot of sense that the fire dances says, never been like me, but I was about to speak and got nervous. Understandably so. Understandably so. Um, and thank you for saying that. Thanks for just being real. Anna says, oh, Anna's quoting, how to speak from authority without using words that are authoritative. Ashe. Yeah. Hey, Adam. Welcome to the container. Nobu says in the chat, can Big relate to excelling at English literature as a non native English speaker? Mm-hmm. Thanks for saying and thanks for reflecting that. And it's so interesting because I feel like for a long time I've been working through the karma of the English language. Um, and I won't name what all the karma is because I didn't create it. But I will say that there is a lot of karma in written words, in written language, and it's something that we talk about often um, in the room, and especially and hopefully more so in the Sharia way. That I think that that's a very like Taoish perspective to take, um, to say that like naming something and also like garnering meaning or like foraging meaning in language is part of building a construction to things that are otherwise true, whether or not they have a name. So, um, Ashe. Nobu writes in the chat, as always, we're having discussions which is perpendicular to the reading. Laughing my ass off, and in my opinion, I agree. So yeah, I guess to kind of like anchor not only in the text but also in our own personal experiences, I guess I would love to hear um, from y'all and hold space to hear from y'all about your own experiences with the way that you've noticed energy kind of coalesce at your solar plexus. I also feel like asking what is y'all's relationship to your throat chakra, similar to the way that like Nobu kind of offered as a framework, where I feel for me personally, like my throat chakra is constantly growing consistently. And I'm just kind of curious if that relates to you all at all.
Hey,
Hi.
yeah, so I wanted to share like from my experience, let me say my recent experience, how like coming back to being vocal has been. Um so firstly, like I noticed that because I had a period where I wasn't really speaking much. I'm still kind of coming out of there.
Mm-hmm.
But on my journey out of there and like coming to become more vocal, more articulate, I've noticed like I have had to use my voice like more, uh would I say instantaneously, or I mean more like in a utility way, you know, and actually making solid marks. So when I have to speak, I would have to like muster up as much energy as I can,
Mm-hmm.
so I'll be able to say as concise as I want to, which is mostly like as concise as possible,
Mm-hmm.
and also like uh, pass across my message when I have to speak. So in that sense too, like I've been would I say counting my words. So I
Mm-hmm.
barely use too many. So it's kind of almost like I challenge myself in a way, but it's that challenge has kind of like helped me to hmm curb leaking. You know, I
Mm-hmm.
think you said leeching, and then Noble said in chat leaking versus leeching.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so yeah, it's helped me to curb leaking of my power, you know, from the things that I say, which was something I wasn't aware of before that
Mm-hmm.
used to happen. And s- since I stopped speaking so much, I now I can easily like recognize when someone is on the other extreme, which is like, you know, talking a lot and leaking power from themselves, you know. So that's one thing that I
Yeah.
wanted to share.
Sashay. Thanks for saying that, Excel. And I appreciate you kind of front loading your experience, because a lot of what you said resonates and also aligns to periods in my own life where I've I've gone, well, like when I'm having a really big spiritual opening, specifically where that was hard. Oh, I'm glad you did it. That's what Excel says in the chat, that was hard to transmit. Um, and that feels aligned. I feel like the truth of one's experience is what my mom would say, not easy. And transmitting it, I feel like it's not easy, but is also, I feel like what you said, worthwhile. I also really love what you said about carving space, um, and how speaking to your experience takes power back. I would, if you want to say more, you don't have to unmute if you don't want to. You can write it in the chat, but I would love to hear more about that, because what I was saying earlier is that I feel like it relates to times where I've gone completely like nonverbal, um, at the behest of a really big spiritual opening, and then returning back to language has been very difficult for me in my experience, and not impossible, but in the sense that there were bridges that I had to build with language, the spoken word, and in short, my throat chakra, in order to facilitate what you were saying is like a carving out of one's energetic atmosphere. So I really appreciate that.
Well, actually, I said curbing. Like,
Okay.
yeah, I said
Curbing.
curbing energy leaks. That's what I said.
Ashe.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
um yeah, so like getting silent and not using as many words. Yeah, that's what I've said. So yep.
Yeah, I appreciate you qualifying that. Curbing. That feels aligned. That actually feels very aligned too. And like maybe we're both speaking to like two different polarities of how you can do that with words. So yeah, I'm just holding more space. Nobu in the chat shared a Malayan tapestry that he had picked up, and it's gorgeous. The textures of color and contrast is really giving life right now to me. Anna says, I like what you said about leaking energy through the voice at Excel, just responding to what he said. Anna says, because people do be doing that, like, shush for a moment, lol. Do you want to say more about your experience, Anna, with um, the voice and energy leakages, or how you understand that?
Yeah, I guess I could speak to it. I think, well, something that came to me is like actually something that you said once upon a time that really made an impact on me, which was like, you know, the words that you use make an impact, and also like just as much as the words that you do use and when you do speak, um, it's almost more impactful when you don't speak
Mhm.
and when you don't use your words. Um, and so I think sometimes I'll just get irritated, like if I'm in a moment with someone and it's like they are just using their voice to fill the space because they're uncomfortable with silence, or because like they need to like hear their own voice to like, because they can't be, I don't know, they can't like sit without saying anything,
Mhm.
um or like, if I'm like in nature or something and I'm like looking at a tree, like I don't need to be talking all the time, like, um and yeah, sometimes I do just want to be like, shh, just like be quiet.
Can relate. Can relate. Can relate. I'm happy that you said that too, because I also feel like that's a phenomenon that also is like very, very poignantly to me describes the current climate where like a lot of people are just speaking because like the words are available. And there's also maybe a little bit of like karma to ripen around one's relationship to silence. So I'm glad you brought in silence too, because I also feel it can be just like Hazrat Inayat Khan is writing about how medicinal the voice can be, and also like how you can read and scry an atmosphere based on the voice or the sound that it's exuding. And I also feel like some people who are very refined and in touch with their senses can do the same thing in a silent atmosphere. And so I it's starting to make me wonder if all of these different energetic spaces we were just talking about, like the solar plexus, the throat chakra, if there's like a relationship between um those two senses that help us like like tune to our environment, but also like figure out when a particular environment warrants a particular sound, even if that sound is silenced. So thank you for saying that. I'm just looking and reading through the chat. I'm also holding space if anyone wants to unmute and speak to anything that might be coming up for them at this moment.
I think
Oh,
I think one thing I usually recall when thinking of like words, space, silence is how they say um the silence in the music is like as well as impactful as the notes that are played in the music. So that's one thing I think about or think back to. So
mhm,
that has me, you know, feeling or like reaching into how important like silence is,
mm,
you know. And for
mhm,
me, like with the time that has gone through, I feel like what happened for me was is a certain a kind of death,
mm,
and that's exactly how I've been feeling. It's like I died
mm,
and I was in complete silence. And something that's also like synonymous with that is um like freezing temperatures, like total
mm,
cold, you know. So like in a way, I'd say like my voice box was complete death, you know, in complete death. And how cold, you know, it's felt kind of like traces back to that. And sometimes I used to feel like very certainly that I'm lacking some warmth. So being in the depths of silence and then making little waves to reach out to make more sound, you know,
mm.
is currently where I'm at. So I'm just sharing that experience.
Wow. I appreciate that, Excel. It's for some reason right now, what it's bringing up for me is echolocation, which is not mentioned in the text at all. But that idea of sending waves through the ethers, like communicative ways, is I guess how I'm understanding it. Um, is also I think one form of communication that I would say is like primordial to speaking. And like as you were speaking, I was like my field and like my body was like inspired to do these like gestural head nods that like I picked up from my parents and my ancestry that have to do with like that have to do with primordial ways of communicating, which can be expressed simply through like when you're around people and someone's asking you to look at something, they point to something or they like move their chin to be like it's right there, um, or like how you know you might make sounds or grunts that kind of exude from the body or the voice box that aren't communicating maybe like that shielding like higher level of truth, right? But it's like communicating a truth that's like localized to your body. And like I think about like humming, like grunting, like I said earlier, is one of those things. um when people eat something and they're like it's like it's communicating something um, through the shared medium of space and time that people are in at any given time, or when people are relating to themselves. I feel like that's also part and parcel of it is learning how to. And I guess that's kind of what I was saying earlier, where like the voice is sometimes to me especially if we're working within the framework of like power that Hazrat Inayat Khan presented to us, I feel like often, um, yeah, that I use my voice in that sense to carve out my atmosphere, to carve within, when it comes to like my inner atmosphere or like my inner universe. And I think that it's something that is available to us, but that sometimes gets overshadowed by the need to communicate something lexically. And so, yeah, I'm kind of glad that we're here. And thanks again, Excel, for expanding on that point.
Thing, craziest story, yeah. So last year, when I was doing like a lot of energy work, I think I got to a point in, let me say, my transmissions, or my movements, where I didn't need to use my voice anymore. And there was like something I was doing where I was like using like my brain like directly. So
Mm,
crazy. And like it used to make some clicking sounds, and sometimes I would just go off clicks, and I would
mm,
use like click sounds from the back of my throat to dismember things. Like it was so handy. Like it was like clicking a button, instead of, like doing a lot of waving movements. I would just do that, or I would, tap on something or myself, or like, and
mhm,
while you were speaking, that just reminded me of that. And okay, that's first thing. Second thing, so I recently got into reading manga, and it's been real wild for me, because so most of the manga I read, like, they're in black and white, and they have words and images. And I think I've kind of gotten, hung up on them. But it's like
mhm,
I'm used to watching the anime with sound, moving pictures and everything. But now it's like I'm just in one place, in a totally like silent mood, and I get transported into this other world. And it's like my friend said something the other day, and I was like, I read that in my manga voice. So it's like
mhm,
it's transmitting so much, you know, and without much medium. It's literally through your eyes, then you start to hear within yourself and create all the pictures within yourself. So I think that's another kind of communication too, that this dialogue reminds me of.
mhm.
Yep.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. I was writing in the chat that I think this is how clairaudient starts to open up for people. And it's like I kind of said it as a joke, but then I was like, no, actually, wait, that's how it happened for me a lot of the times, especially what you said about sound waves and then the images flooding in, or your experience of experiencing images as you dismember or like remove obstructions from your perception. And I want to, yeah, I kind of want to just hold space and make sure that I was understanding that correctly. I was also likening it, oh my god, likening it to Dogon technology. um and so it feels really related to the way that um, lineages that were connected to Sirius or are connected to Sirius, um, and sometimes what we call like blue avian consciousness, I think darted or like offered communication tech to Earth's consciousness. And so for me, it's bigger than this book a little bit. And I think that's why I'm kind of like centered in this book, is because I'm like, there is a magic. And I think Anna put it in the chat earlier, like the human voice box, or the human voice is so intricate, and it's really divine. I think for the reasons that we're talking about now. No,
Yeah, I
Booster.
feel like
Oh, sorry.
I'm I'm like really laughing about this because I feel like the timing of Excel coming back into the fold, and just like this book club exegesis and hanging out underneath this Dogon Malian blanket is really funny to me. But yeah, I think like definitely what you're saying about this being something which can be received by people who connect to like blue avian consciousness or even like Sirius consciousness makes sense. I also feel like it's really interesting to me what you said about clairaudience opening up this way, because I felt like when XL was talking about this kind of technology that I was using the same technology, but I feel like I'm using it from like the other direction in some way because I feel like XL was saying how this has come to substitute, let's say, moving from like the lower dantian and like actually like, you know, making physical movements of the body. Whereas for me, like what I was doing to dismember myself a lot before I kind of onboarded this tech was like doing visualizations, right? So it's like coming from the other end of the channel. And like my
Mm,
typical process then came mostly from theosophical teachings that I had learned from a teacher that some of us are familiar with, whose name is Kenneth Haver. Um, and like, you know, it was just like mad time consuming. Like I'd get up in the morning, I'd feel like something was stirring up something, and then I would like set this container in a very visual way, and then I would set containers in very visual ways, and then I would work with containers and run energies over them in a very like formalistic or symbolic or even mythic way. And then
mm,
at some point, I felt like, you know, I'd been using my body to like test 3 times if something um, could be moved, and I suddenly started getting these like I was just like spontaneously moving in the same way that my body used to move when I was
mm,
asking what yes felt like. And then at some point, yeah, like just the gnosis came in that I was like, okay, like this is how you dismember things now. Like you'll feel something
mm,
and then you'll get some sense of where it is in your body and then sometimes what it pertains to. And
mm,
then you'll feel like you're just being like edged off. You know, like I kind of had the image of like different sort of like karmically distorted versions of myself being sort of like, you know, hanging onto the edge of a cliff. And then
mm,
like the rest of my field sort of like stepping on the fingers, which are like keeping them attached. So yeah, it's basically like anywhere between like 15 and like 150 times a day. I'll just feel my channel go like boom, boom, boom. And then I'll
mm,
feel stuff just like leaving.
mm,
And I'm very curious because it doesn't sound like clicks to me, like Excel is describing, but it feels more like, you know, like my physical body is moving. Um, so I'm really curious to see what's being remembered about this technology in our bodies in real time.
Ashe. Ashe.
I'm I'm very excited about clairaudience opening up for me because I do think it relates to the throat chakra,
Yes.
and I think it's like a shortcut to get to certain things, you know.
Oh, yeah. That's what I was kind of feeling into as you were speaking. I'm like, yeah, like just the way that you also described it, like onboarding the tech. I'm like, yeah, because like even, you know, when we're learning like new skills in the material, how like there's a time period where you're kind of training your muscle memory to like get on board and the line with the movements it takes to do X, Y, and Z. And then there's a certain point, I think, to relay it back to like spiritual cultivation where the like mimetic visualization tool, let's say, is in and of itself is mirrored from an affect in the field that's already true, that's already real, and I would say is already bloomed. And so this perpendicular like directionality, um, I agree. I don't think it's that fixed because I think at least for me and my gnosis, what I've found is that like, you know, we often talk about like the higher chakras as like one school of sense perception, and then we think about the lower chakras as like one school of like sense perception. But I also feel like there's this way that upper chakras technology, let's say, is kind of dipped into the waters of the lower chakras, and from there kind of comes back with let's say like field geometry that is like um more true to the cymatics that are living in each of our lineages. So like in other words, if you're onboarding particular text specifically when it relates to like clairaudience, I think because the brain is part of that process, it's going to draw on influences that feel safe and that are time honored. And then I think after a while, especially if you're like dismembering yourself like 100 times a day, it's going to like, and I say that like from a place of like reverence because I think that's really cool. and I think that after a while, the marriage between those systemic flows of energy that open up when you dismember, it's like the body and the cells remember, and they like remember on a like micro biometric level, to where the thought process or the event like timelines, the event horizons that have to take place for someone to move in a particular way actually kind of get cleared out of the way. In other words, it won't take as much to do as much or to have the energetic impact um, on on a field or a particular atmosphere, because the technology almost lights up in our it's so, I'm getting so many downloads about how like the fifth dimensional reality of the throat chakra mixes and mingles with the second dimensional reality of like our earth star chakras. And so I'm like, we can get into the anatomy if you guys want to, but I also feel like yeah, like I have a couple of notes from this process, because for me in total, the time that it took for me to open my throat chakra or to reach a state of coherence with my throat chakra took 2 years in total. But I also feel like even just talking about it and having held space for myself while that was happening, like directly correlates to it not having to take as long for other people. Does that make sense, y'all? I'm just reading the chat. XL says, dang, Nobu, I can totally feel what you're saying, even happening right now in my body. I've had a couple of curious things happen to me recently where I heard things said in my body. XL also says, this whole container is tingling my brain. Nobu's laughing and spitting out some ashes. Thank you, Anna, for reflecting. Only 2 years. And it's funny because I'm like, also like my sense of time completely changed during that initiation as well. So it just, yeah, this discussion feels really, really timely for me. I'm curious if you guys have other questions or what's coming up for y'all.
I guess like something that came up around what you said about the second chakra and the fifth chakra, like the second dimension, the fifth dimensional realm of the throat chakra, aligns a ton for me because of like an initiation I had where just before I got on the flight to Sedona, I just took out all these markers and started drawing swirls around my chakras. And like one of the shapes that I drew definitely went from like my sacral up, you know, kind of like just wound around my body and then ended up circling around my throat chakra. I think it makes sense to me because for me, the sacral chakra, the sacral chakra, relates to like creativity definitely, but I think it also relates to the idea that creation tends to flow between places of different potential difference, which is like how Taoist people, Taoist practitioners call it. Also, I'd say like how it's described in a book called The Roots of Chinese Qigong. But you know, so like creativity flows between points of separation, and I think that connects to how for me the sacral relates to yeah, like acting or behaving towards others, like interacting really, right? So, you know, given that the throat chakra is a center for me, like of like symbolic expression, and given that, you know, most humans are pretty highly developed towards interacting via symbol, it makes sense to me that those two, yeah, like I would say like dimensional portals of the subtle body are pretty like closely linked. And then I think the other aspect of what you were talking about, which I think anchors back into the text, is, you know, like Hazrat Inayat Khan has spoken, I think, about making sounds which you can't hear. And I feel like that relates a lot to the lower dantian. you know, like what I think he calls just like vibration.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, obviously like sound is a form of vibration, light's a form of vibration, but I think what he's talking about is like um vibration which doesn't show up in any other way. So I think, yeah, this also for me connects to like gravity and, you know, speaking with gravitas. I'm curious how that lands for y'all.
Dang. I knew gravity was gonna make it into this container. I knew it. And yeah, I think I'm just gonna hold some space too, because I would love to hear like y'all's reflections. And I'll read what Anna said in the chat. Anna says, "Do y'all feel like it's static?" And then it goes on to say, "I feel like I've had periods of time where my throat opens a lot and then it recedes or something, more like waves." Ashe. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I'm curious when you say it's static, or do y'all feel it's static, in relation to what?
Oh,
Mm,
I guess I think I was responding to like, well, maybe I misunderstood what you were saying, but you said something about like, oh, it took me 2 years, and then I was
mm.
just like, what took? I was curious if you could speak more on that.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah, the process of like opening my throat chakra and opening to clairaudience in particular, I feel took 2 years. Yeah. And then Nobu says in response to Anna about the periods of time where her throat opens and closes. Nobu says definitely feels like definitely lots of phases in my experience. Yeah. Mm. And I guess, yeah, to kind of like, no, I'm going to hold a little space. I've been talking for a long time, which I don't mind doing, but yeah, I just want to hold space to see what's coming up for y'all.
I guess what's coming up for me is a little tangential, but I think you mentioned earlier something about like English
Mm-hmm.
and authoritativeness. And, you know, like we've been talking mostly about gravity and then we've been talking about sound, but I think we haven't necessarily talked about like the astral vibrations of different words.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like a constant like fascination to me as someone who's you know, a student of etymology, how yeah, like when you look at English words, more or less like half of the words come from like Latinic languages, and then the other half come from say like Germanic languages. Um, and I'm kind of curious if y'all have any insight on how those, I want to say like astral vibrations feel, um, you know, coming from like Germanic roots versus Latinic roots in the English language.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because we do have an etymology channel here, and I've noticed that too as we share more and more on words and like their roots. And so uh, I have like very spicy gnosis on where I think those roots come from, and like, but I mean, you asked about the astral implications, so I won't go into that. And I feel like um it speaks to kind of the cultural atmosphere that influenced the no, we said go on, Dan. But yeah, I guess at first I'll say like the influence speak to, of course, cultural influence as well to me. I also feel as though some of the Latinic roots tend to, well, one thing I have noticed is that the Latinic roots of certain words and certain English words um tend to have more flair, and that just might be like my perspective. Whereas words and language that has Germanic roots feels more martial. And so like there's this quality of defense, this quality of attack, this quality of I don't know why that word is coming for me right now, but there's another word that doesn't feel related to this context coming to me at this moment. And yeah, and just to kind of like bilateralize that, I feel like the influence of like Latinic words and sounds on the English language have to do with more Venusian coded spiritual lineages. And so I wonder with that framework, if that aligns for y'all, what that brings up for you guys regarding the English language. I'm not going to say holding space because Excel said holding space is an interesting expression. And now I feel like really self-conscious about it. And it's okay. Like being aware of something is not the worst, you know? But I'm going to back up a little and let other people speak. Hold space, please. Adam says nothing coming up with the Venusian influence on Latin felt very true to me. Yeah, especially if we're thinking about this framework where it's like language and sound is co-created and like through interactions with other people, through the environment that we're in. And I feel like what's coming up for me right now has to do with the spirit in which is the spirit that's infused into a particular language and how that spirit can remain active through just like any other spiritual offering, right? Like if you pour out some water and libations for a particular spirit, that keeps that spirit doing what it needs to do, assuming that it's doing what it needs to do in the astrals. It feels very similar to words, where it's like words are given power. Sound is giving power through, of course, the vessel that exudes it, but also like the collective agreement with others when that sound is exuded. So like I'm speaking right now and we've agreed that like English is our language of choice. And so like y'all understand me and I of course understand y'all. Maybe not of course, which is why I ask questions, but y'all, I understand y'all and there's this exchange. And I feel as though there's, especially if we go back to like the bit on subtle anatomy, because a lot of lineages do talk about this inherent connection between the throat chakra and the sacral chakra. And I don't want to delineate too far from the like roots of the English language, but it does feel like there's a part of the throat chakra similar to the way that the sacral flows energy up to our solar, our hearts, and also flows energy back down to our root and our earth star. I feel like there's a part of the throat chakra that wants to function in that way, but because of the astral implications of English being so polarized, I feel like it's very hard to dance, and some people struggle with using the voice as an instrument, as Hazrat Inayat Khan alludes to, because the mechanism and the way that we're used to energy flowing, just like on a trail, like if you walk on a trail long enough and like enough people walk on it, that trail is a pathway that others can see and walk on as well. But I also feel like there's this impact that English has on the throat chakra. And the only reason why I speak about it in that way is because English is not my native language. So that's also coloring my perspective too. But I also wonder how that lore sits with you all and what you kind of deduce from there.
Yeah, I was saying in the chat, like, yeah, I really like what you said about the polarities of different sets of etymons in the English language. And yeah, I guess the image that was coming to me of trying to navigate speaking in English is sort of like if you had to have like, you know, maybe on your left foot, you've got like a massive clown shoe. And then like on your right foot, you're wearing, yeah, you know, say like like leather slippers or something like that, or one leather slipper, and you can guess which one's Latinic and which one's Germanic from my perspective. But I mean, I pasted like a screenshot for the etymology of the word win, and it's like basically I'll say from Proto-Germanic winana, which is to swing, labor, win, gain, fight, from the Proto-Indo-European win, which is to strive, wish, desire, and love. And I feel like it's reflective of a general kind of urgency, I would say, in the astral realms when it comes to words. Or like etymons, which are used in Germanic languages, including English. Um, and then, yeah, I'd say like, sometimes people say that a large percentage of English vocabulary comes from Latinic, but the grammar is like Germanic. So there's also that, right? It's like, yeah. So, I mean, it's not the only language which is such a hybrid of different languages at all. But I'd say that, like when I think about like Tagalog or Bahasa, which is like heavily Dutch influenced, but also comes from like, I want to say a lot of like Malayalam type languages or Sanskrit type languages from the southeast of Asia. They're both very intricate systems, I would say. Whereas like the polarity between Latinic, which I would say is very intricate, and then Germanic, which is basically like, do the thing I need you to do for me right now before I lose my shit, is like a very interesting fit for me.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for saying that because I feel like it also speaks to like the spirit of languages and like what's behind them. Maybe not necessarily like each person's intent when they speak, which is hard to qualify through just listening. But I feel like you'd have to like ask a question back and there would have to be like some sort of exchange. But definitely, definitely. Thank you for speaking to that. Yeah. I'm just reading the chat too, and also just letting that kind of like process.
So English is my first language, so I don't really have like, it can be hard for me to like kind of access this conversation because I'm like, I don't really know anything different other than English. But I did learn how to read Hebrew when I was a kid. I don't know what the words mean when I'm saying them, but I used to be able to read it. And I can tell you that when I returned to attempting to read Hebrew as an adult, like in the past couple months, like when I speak it, it's like it actually requires like a whole different energetic posture, and it like actually requires like, I feel like more breath awareness somehow. And I don't know if that's because like it's just like a little bit foreign to me still, but I do feel like I'll be reading prayers and I'll be like out of breath at the end of it, and I'm like, wait, that's wild. It's like actually like your breath has to like maybe like take up more space in your body or something. Like it's just so interesting to me.
Mhm. Thank you for speaking to that, Anna. Yeah, because I'm like also that context is super important. And I also was like kind of like thinking about that in terms of like how this container would sound to those who do speak English and like those whose language is whose root language is English. And I also yeah, no, because Nobu wrote in the chat, I feel Latin is more heart and root, whereas Germanic is like deep root. And I think it, for me, kind of relates to also what you said about like the breath taking up more space in the body. Because I also often think about how, well, there's like a couple of things coming up for me. I think one of the things that I wanted to speak to right now, at least, is like how different languages with different root structures, I think, to me at least, have like an impact or like directly kind of like speak to the body's rootedness, or like how rooted the people who were like creating the language were, I guess you can say. And it also came up for me when like Nobu was bringing up the example about how like Germanic languages are like kind of like demand oriented with like very little room for interpretation, lots of room for potentiating consequence for not doing what was said or barked at to someone else. And then the comparison of, yeah, this idea that Latinic languages are more heart and root centered, um, which lines up for me. I feel like I like learned and took some like college classes on like Arabic, and like I was also starting to do a lot of somatic energy work on my own self. And I was just like, whoa, it's unbelievable how how I'm even like my body wants to sit, or like how yeah, like that energetic posture you spoke to, I feel like is very, very alive in this container right now. So thank you for saying that.
One thing I just wanted to share that I noticed here, like I think I said, the depth of breath is adjacent to the energetic posture of the language, and I think in a way I just want to expand on what I mean. So the way Anna said that sometimes she felt out of breath, like when she was speaking, I feel like English. Okay, let me not say English, but I mean some languages could have, more demand like of your energy, like in a certain way to speak. Like an example, which I just tried out, was saying different words like in different languages, like the word for one now, like one in English, that's kind of hard compared to let's say French, where you have on, that's like that's so easy to say, but in English it's more like one, that kind of like takes a lot of your breath. I'm even out of breath like just to say one, you know. And that that's the first thing. The second thing is I was wondering how the influence of the gods, because I think Adam said the Venetian influence in Latin, and that got me thinking about how how Latin has, for me in my experience, has always felt like uh, more influenced by Venus, and I was thinking about like what god or what would I say myth influenced English, and I guess I'm just relating that to how much or how out of breath I am like speaking English, and that thirdly, like that also reminds me of how I listen to other people speak their languages. For instance, when I hear like my native people, like, or like my dad speaking his language, it's like how it comes out so fluently. And I think because of how maybe let me say connected, due to how their breath works with the language, they can say so much in such a short span of time. I think that's one character. Another character could be saying so many things with fewer words. Like I think there's one language that does that. I can't remember which right now. But if you would translate that to English, I think it's Japanese. If you translate that to English, it like have so many words, but they said it in a different way, and also the understanding of what that phrase is tends to be so simple to them, because I don't know, like um they would process like what that phrase means. Maybe it's also like how it sounds too, but I think there are different things you could pick up on that, and I think that's the fourth thing. So I'm just curious about the God's influence in that, and also the other thing I was saying before, which I can't remember now, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Axel. I don't know if y'all can hear. There's someone literally speaking Spanish in the background right now, just speaking to um different lineages. But yeah, I guess I would be curious too about what you said regarding the gods and their influence on language and phraseology, and also like linguistics. And I feel like oh, hey Lump, welcome to the space. um Gosh, I was going to say something. Hmm. I'll pause for a second to see if it'll come back to me, but I wonder, yeah, I'm just holding space. I'm kind of wondering what else is coming up for folks.
I guess what came up for me when Exo was talking about gods and different influences on language sort of also relates to, I think, things we've talked about in the room for like a long time, about how different lineages not only have like different subtle anatomy, but also different articulations of subtle anatomy. So like I tend to use like a 7 chakra system and also like a 3 dantian system, but I don't really use the connections to physical organs that say like traditional Chinese medicine uses. But yeah, it just kind of got me thinking about how the influence of different vasta beings can change, both our genetic code and also epigenetic markings on our genetic code, such that over time we actually, like end up developing like pretty different physical organs, let's say, which we use to perceive, the all that is through the lens of, say, color and sound and tone. And this also relates to a conversation that, brew member Jess 5199 started, I'd say, today. And also just like, understanding that different animals have literally like different equipment in their eyes because they need to see certain colors with more fidelity than others. And I feel like this all speaks to, for me, like what we might be able to call like gods from a certain perspective.
That tracks for me. I also was wondering too, if you could expand a bit on what you said regarding like the exchange of like genetic material through language or spoken word,
Oh,
if you want to.
I mean, I think like the connection for me is like different physical organs end up creating like different subtle anatomy, which ends up creating different language. Just because, yeah, I think like, if we're louder in certain aspects of our subtle anatomy, then that's going to change the way that we end up articulating ourselves, both in terms of like sound and also in terms of like language.
Yeah, that feels aligned to me, and I also um am thinking about what you said earlier about how different lineages have different, I guess, interpretations or points of access to the subtle body anatomy and shared subtle body anatomy, like, of the one. So yeah, that brings up a lot for me.
Whoops, I'm not muted.
And that's okay. um I'm just clearing some stuff right now, y'all. I'm a little thrown off my game because there's a repairman here right now. So thanks for waiting. I'm just finding my center. Yes, I remember my point. Okay, there was also something coming through for me, and I recall tweeting this very cheekily in response to Sirius B Shaman, who's a Twitter account that I would say tweets like prophecy that they get from the astral. And I remember I don't know what came over me, but on my alt page called Push and Flax Seeds, I remember tweeting that there will be a time, and again, take this prediction lightly, very, very lightly, but I remember saying that there was going to be a time where we might see um, things in our subtle anatomy, not on the physical anatomy, but in the subtle anatomy that look very similar to like gills and fins and like swimming technology. And I think for me, the what that relates to and translates back to me from the subtle world is these, um, I guess you can say, subtle anatomy organs. To kind of take us back to what we were talking about earlier about like clairaudience developing and different psychic senses being cultivated over time. Um, I do think that there's a lot of lineages. They might not be mainstream. There's a lot of lineages that have held on to and preserved the wisdom of integrating parts of this subtle body anatomy. Um, yes. And yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. Novu. Novu says, I'm ready for the ether to feel thicker and more textured. And I do think that even this container with us talking about sound and the voice, like from someone who probably like does not even play around with the woo, they'll be like, what the F are these people talking about? But because many of us are engaged in our own spiritual practice or engaging with our own etheric bodies in a particular way, I think there is this kind of felt sense where you can almost, and also after like cultivating your spiritual gnosis after a like set period of time, there is this part of the journey that I think what I was describing earlier, where these other parts of the body get included or other parts of our awareness get included into this larger subtle body. And so for me, the way that that translates often, especially coming back to the throat chakra, um, and I do this exercise almost daily where I like look at myself in the mirror and I like kind of imagine the back of my throat like fanning out, fanning outwards. And like often when I close my eyes, the visual that I get is that of gills, this ability to like breathe underwater. I also sometimes will meditate on my sacral. And I think I've shared this before in a different container where I'm like, I literally sometimes feel like my lower body is like a tail, like an aquatic being's tail is what it feels like sometimes. And so I don't know if I would be part of the camp of people who are like, we're going to get these downloads in our body. Because I know a lot of people say kind of like crazy shit, I'll be honest. But I also do feel like there is this mechanism in parts of the subtle body anatomy that directly relate to our physical anatomy that are opening to kind of hold space for these, the ability to like open up more space in certain energy centers to interpret and be able to receive transmissions from the heavens or the ethers or the skies or the higher chakras, depending on what lineage you come from. Yes, I am, Anna. Anna says, Hoda, are you a mermaid? Ashe, yes, in the ethers. There's some funny gifts in the chat now. Gil Tech Nobu says, Nobu's also sharing a picture of pasta. This is gorgeous. Yes, Ashe to the ethers becoming more moldable. Excel says sonic beings different in water versus air. Interesting. Yep. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna hold some space now. I'm like, okay, I dropped some pretty wild lore, and I wonder what's coming up for y'all. I also just got a notification that someone who I thought followed me already is now following me. And I'm like, dang, whole time I thought we were, never mind. But yeah, I'm curious what's coming up for y'all.
That wasn't me, was it? Because I made a new account.
No. Thanks for asking, though. I put who in the chat because I don't want to say it out loud and dox them. I mean, they know who they are and I know who they are. That's important.
I just followed you today. I think earlier or yesterday, I forget. But I'm Lumpfist now.
Awesome.
I guess like what was coming up with regard to sonics in water versus air is just like how you can kind of see like sound traveling across water, which I just think speaks to like just like I want to say like channels opening up for tuning into the ether, and being complementary to other channels. I know we're getting very metaphorical, which is kind of interesting to me, but
I know.
I'm here for it.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. And it's interesting because I'm like, okay, there's like part of me that wants to anchor back in the book. And then there's another part of me that wants to kind of like close the book club container and hold space for a transmission on, like softly and gently opening to these spaces in our field that are probably already open. So I guess, yeah, I'll hold more space in regards to the contents of the book. And then I think I'll let Craig go. Oh, yeah. That was a really good part. Nobu writes, I kind of want to tell stories about how people voices got weird when they got hijacked.
I might be able to speak to that. Do other people hear? I guess are we talking about like hearing voices or things like that?
I'd say that's welcome. Yeah. We definitely
I
are talking
have.
to their audience. So that's under, the same umbrella to me.
Sorry to interrupt. I have experience with I guess, which is hard for me to talk about sometimes, but I've been told that I'm clairaudient. I do hear words, but they're not through I don't know how to explain it. It's almost as if it takes the sound that already exists and it translates it into sounds that represent words, but they don't always mean the literal word that they mean. It's been an experience since I was 15. So I've had experience with it 20 years, and it's often been incorrect, but it's also been correct in terms of predictive stuff. But I've also felt, as Nobu has mentioned, like being hijacked and getting the wrong messages. I'm still working with this, and I'm always like trying to learn more about it.
Mhm. Dude, thank you for speaking to that because I also feel like if there was a part two to this conversation where there which there might be, I don't know. I'm a vibe with it. I feel like the we talked a little bit earlier before you came into the container about the way that solar plexus works and how like sometimes other people's energy in that area of the body can sort of muffle out the way or the mechanism of cultivating like your own intuitive gnosis and how um yeah, like it wavers sometimes I think based on which energies are present in the solar plexus. And so I I also feel like we've talked about this in other places in the room that it has to do with like astral reception. And so to me, I would whittle all of that in, not saying that this word contains all of what you said, but I would whittle that into a category of like discernment. Um and how I feel like there's like this secondary because earlier I was talking about how it's taken me like 2 years to really like hone in on that clairaudience tip. And I think that also had to do with like just kind of like cleaning out my solar plexus because I remember at the same time I had actually gone vegan for the first time in my life where I was like, yo, my channel is so open that I'm being exposed to almost even the sense perception of the food that I'm eating that I kind of wanted to like change that so that my channel um in my upper chakras could be more clear. So I really appreciate you speaking to that.
Thank you. A lot of what you're saying makes sense to me. Working with the solar plexus, I think I struggle with, and I think it can kind of, as you said, muffle or distort really what I'm receiving. Um, and also the throat chakra. But I wanted to get back to what Nobu originally meant, which was like if people's voice, like their actual physical voice changes if they're
Yeah.
hijacked. I feel like I've experienced that as well.
Do you want to say more about it? Like what is it? What does it feel? Because I have too. I would love to hear what it's been like for you.
Um, so when I get into these really heightened states of, I guess, connection, but it's not always clear what's happening, but it'll feel like something is speaking through me, and is not necessarily belonging to me.
Mm.
In my my tone might change, my even my accent might change a little. It
Mm.
really depends. Um, but it definitely, the sensation of it not being like me is a part of it.
Mhm. Definitely agreed. Yeah. I wonder how other people experience that when your voice gets hijacked or like even being on the receiving end of it, like hearing someone out and being like, that person sounds different or they don't sound like they usually sound. I would love to hear from y'all.
I mean, I feel like, honestly, and I feel like this might make some people uncomfortable, but I feel like we can be hijacked sometimes, in helpful ways and also in less helpful ways. Um, so like I think, like probably a lot of us have been in containers where someone's channeling and like their throat kind of like gets a little scratchy or something. And I feel like for me that's a sign sometimes that they're channeling, aspects of their vaster self which are not necessarily coming through an integrated channel. But it's almost like, like you're making a hole there so that you can invite integration between like wherever another open part of them is and then that hole. And I feel like it can often be like pretty cosmic, but I would still call it like technically like a form of hijacking. But then also, yeah, I've definitely had experiences where like, people I was connected with kind of like disappeared for a while. And then at some moment of expansion, they called me and like they just sounded like a completely different person.
Mm.
And I could tell that like stuff was like coming through them. and it was pretty spooky. I'd say like the first time I noticed it really hard, like it chilled me.
Mhm.
But yeah, I
Um,
think it's, like all this stuff is subtle because I also feel like sometimes when I'm channeling my ancestors, like the way that I speak, the way that I accent my English will be slightly different too. And it doesn't necessarily feel like being hijacked because it's like coming from like within my body,
Mhm.
versus like from outside.
just a question. How do you distinguish between the feeling of like something hijacking you and something coming from you?
Yeah, I mean, it's really subtle, but I'd say for like me, and that's because like, I've done like a lot of root chakra work and sacral work. It's like I can tell that something's like burrowing into my subtle body
Mm.
if I feel like a lot of tension or numbness around like either one of those polarities versus just like, feeling I can comfortably expand into every area of my body. So like there'll be parts where it feels like it's more constrained or like I can feel around the edges of something within my subtle body. And if that's activated, I would say that I'm probably channeling something that's attached to me. And often in those times I'll be called to like not I'll just be called to like try and harmonize whatever um like disorganized energy is being like siphoned or attached to by something from outside my body.
Yeah, I'm kind of also feeling into the distinction that you made, and thanks for bridging that context and also mentioning that it takes a lot of root and sacral work to like discern within your own vessel, like which part of yourself you're channeling at any given moment. Um, because I'll say for me, it's very similar. And then I'll also speak to the felt sensation of like people being hijacked. Well, no, I'll just speak to like my own sensation of like being hijacked. And I'll say for me, just like for posterity, it usually happens in my heart space. Those of y'all with bleeding hearts, y'all know what I'm talking about when the heart expands. And I really also really love what you said about burrowing, or the sense of something burrowing into your field, because oftentimes that's what I'll feel in, and it usually happens when I'm doing like big energy work, right? Because I'm probably like lit up in the astrals and looking like a big juicy steak for some demons. And so I'll like expand my field and I'm like, oh my God, I'm one with everything. And then like I'll literally feel it in my left shoulder and I'm like, oh, where I'm like, oh, and it feels like that like tension and like numbness. And it'll feel like a record stops inside of me, because whenever I connect to like an ancestral sense of self, it feels like, I'll say, it depends on what kind of conversation me and my ancestors are having, but it usually feels like warm elixir, like bubbling up from like the base of my spine when it's my ancestors and when I'm having like that ancestral conversation. And even as I say that, like my gut just got warm. But then when I connect, or like when I'm opening my field and I can feel like that sense of like a demon or someone else's ancestors trying to like stick their straw into my field for some juice. It feels like that. It feels like something gets cold. It's like my ability to expand stops. And I think that that's the kind of framework that you offer too, Nobu, about how like um there are like openings that kind of invite this. Yeah, it's all been laid out. There are openings that kind of like invite this energy. I think aligns from my experience as well, and really, really didn't click for me until I started kind of, since we're talking about like technology, right? Like until I started downloading like defensive technology or like martial technology or shielding technology, then I was like, oh, just things. Nobu says that they just killed a mosquito. Ashe. XL says they gotta sip the juices. Ashe, they can try. But yeah, I'm kind of curious if anyone else wants to narrate what their experiences are. And also, I guess, yeah, another thing I want to say is that um I don't want to kind of like leave that container open and without like dropping a suggestion, but it feels like most of the channeling work I do, the like light language work I do, and the movement work I do in my practice is directly correlates to some of these gaps in the astral where other people might not be able to see them, but they are definitely like can be like perpendicularly verified through like gnosis and through spiritual like just like straight up getting in the realms yourself, you know. So yeah, I hope that lands in a way that y'all can pick up. I'm gonna read what Lexi said. Lexi says, I just realized maybe I've been guided to work context out in my mental body more than my physical body or somatically in current time to help develop my clairaudience because I feel like I've been receiving most of my guidance that way thus far. Ashe. Through clairaudience, you mean, Lexi? Okay, yeah. Thanks for clarifying. Yes, lots of codes being offered in this container. Good luck to whoever writes the description, Nobu says. It's going to be Anna. Okay, so I'm going to make an executive decision and end this podcast episode because honestly, yeah. Bye, Craig. Talk to you later. But I also want to say that I'm going to be holding space. So y'all should join the Broom Discord so that you can get all this extra material. So, bye.